The year was 1878, a time when desperate dreams crossed paths with harsh realities, when letters carried promises across thousands of miles, when a woman's worth was measured by her practicality, not her passion. This is the story of Josephine Montgomery, a Boston piano teacher whose refined education became her greatest liability in the untamed Colorado Territory, until she met the one man who saw beyond the surface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Josephine Montgomery's gloved hands trembled slightly as the stagecoach jolted to a stop. Through the dust-caked window, the settlement of Silverdale emerged, a collection of wooden structures dwarfed by the towering Rocky Mountains beyond. Nothing like the brick-lined streets of Boston she had left behind. "End of the line, ma'am," the driver called, his voice gruff from years of shouting over thundering hooves. Josephine gathered her weathered leather valise and the smaller case containing her most precious possession, a miniature watercolor portrait of her deceased parents. 6 weeks of travel had left her navy blue traveling dress wrinkled and her bones aching, but she held her posture straight as she descended from the coach. The mountain air was thin and crisp, burning her lungs with each breath. Her gaze swept across the dusty main street, searching for the face that matched the daguerreotype she'd received 3 months prior. Douglas Harrington had described himself as a successful cattle rancher seeking a wife of suitable temperament and domestic capability. Their exchange of letters over 6 months had led to this moment, her arrival to become his bride. "Miss Montgomery," Josephine turned toward the voice, hope briefly illuminating her tired features. A tall man with a neatly trimmed beard approached, his buttoned vest and polished boots marking him as someone of means in this frontier town. His eyes, however, lacked the warmth she had imagined when reading his letters. "Mr. Harrington," she asked, offering a small curtsy that felt suddenly out of place as several onlookers watched with unconcealed curiosity. "Indeed." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering uncomfortably on her gloves, her carefully styled hair, the delicate cameo at her throat. His frown deepened with each observation. "You're not what I expected." Josephine's heart quickened. "I assure you, sir, I'm the same woman who wrote those letters. Perhaps the journey has left me somewhat—" "It's not your appearance," he interrupted, taking a step back. "Though you are more ornamental rather than practical." The words stung. Around them, the usual bustle of the town continued. Horses nickering, men loading supplies, women gathering at the general store. Yet Josephine felt suddenly alone, as if she and Douglas stood in a bubble of cold silence. "I don't understand," she said, struggling to maintain her composure. "We discussed my background. I mentioned my teaching." "You mentioned teaching?" "Yes," his voice hardened. "You failed to mention it was piano and literature. I expected someone who taught useful skills, someone who could manage a household, assist with accounts, perhaps educate children in practical subjects." A woman nearby stopped pretending not to listen, nudging her companion as they watched the scene unfold. "I can learn what's needed," Josephine offered, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'm quite capable of—" "What I need, Miss Montgomery, is a wife who understands ranch life." Douglas gestured toward her hands. "Those fingers have never churned butter or mended the fence. You speak 3 languages according to your letters, yet I doubt you know the first thing about delivering a calf or preserving meat for winter." Heat rushed to Josephine's cheeks. "Sir, you advertised for an educated companion." "Educated in useful matters," he corrected sharply. "Not Shakespeare and Chopin. This isn't Boston, Miss Montgomery. Your refinement would be wasted here. And frankly, a liability." The whispers around them grew, spectators gathering like vultures sensing weakness. Josephine's throat tightened, but she refused to display her devastation publicly. "I see," she managed, her voice barely audible. Douglas cleared his throat, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small pouch. "I'm not without compassion. This should cover your return journey to wherever you came from. The eastbound stage leaves tomorrow morning." He thrust the pouch toward her. The metallic clink of coins felt like a final insult, payment for her dismissed worth. "And what am I to do until then?" Josephine asked, not touching the offered money. Something like guilt flickered across Douglas's face. "The silver dollar. Inn has rooms. Tell Mrs. Jenkins I sent you." He hesitated, then added awkwardly, "I am sorry for the misunderstanding. You seem like a fine woman, just not suitable for this life." With that, he tipped his hat and turned away, leaving Josephine standing alone with her valise, the curious stares of strangers, and the crushing realization that she had nowhere to go. The journey had consumed most of her savings. Boston held nothing for her. Her teaching position filled, her small apartment surrendered, her few friends scattered to their own lives. The mountain air suddenly felt suffocating. With as much dignity as she could muster, Josephine picked up her belongings and walked toward the weathered sign of the Silver Dollar Inn, ignoring the whispers that followed. Poor thing, too fancy for her own good. What was Harrington thinking, bringing someone like that here? The innkeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, was a stout woman with shrewd eyes that softened slightly at Josephine's predicament. "Just one night," Josephine explained, placing a few precious coins on the counter. "I'll be departing tomorrow." "That's what they all say, honey," Mrs. Jenkins replied, sliding a key across the worn wooden surface. "Room's at the top of the stairs. Don't mind the noise from the saloon below. These walls have heard worse than your crying." "I don't intend to cry," Josephine stated firmly. Though her voice betrayed her, Mrs. Jenkins's weathered face showed the first hint of respect. "Good. Tears don't solve problems out here." The room was spare, a narrow bed, a cracked wash basin, a single window overlooking the dusty street below. Josephine set down her valise and finally allowed her shoulders to slump. 6 months of correspondence, of building hope, of imagining a new life, all destroyed in less than 5 minutes of conversation. She removed her gloves slowly, revealing the hands that had betrayed her, too soft, too cultured, too useless in this raw new world. The hands that could coax bark from piano keys but apparently couldn't contribute to a ranch. She opened her small case and withdrew the portrait of her parents, their refined faces smiling back at her from a world that now seemed impossibly distant. "What now?" she whispered to their painted expressions. Her father had been a professor, her mother a concert pianist. They had raised her to value beauty, art, literature, qualities that had just been deemed worthless. As evening descended on Silverdale, Josephine sat by the window watching the town transform in the fading light. Lanterns flickered to life, casting golden pools on the rutted street. The sounds of the saloon below grew louder, laughter, the clinking of glasses, someone plunking inexpertly at a piano. The painful irony of that sound made her wince. Tomorrow's stagecoach would take her where? Not Boston. Perhaps Denver had opportunities for a woman of her background, or she could continue east to St. Louis. Each option seemed as tenuous as smoke. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. "Miss, there's a gentleman asking after you," Mrs. Jenkins called through the door. "Says he heard about your situation. Wants to speak with you downstairs if you're willing." Josephine stiffened. Another curious onlooker, someone offering unwanted charity, or worse. "Did he give a name?" she asked, approaching the door warily. "Samuel Garrett. Owns the Pinewood Ranch north of town. Respectable enough sort. Keeps to himself mostly." Josephine hesitated. Meeting strange men in a frontier saloon went against every convention she'd been raised with. Yet convention had already failed her spectacularly today. "Please tell Mr. Garrett I'll be down momentarily." She quickly freshened her appearance, pinning loose strands of hair and straightening her collar. Whatever this meeting entailed, she would face it with dignity. The saloon portion of the inn was hazy with pipe smoke and loud with conversation. Heads turned as she descended the stairs, conversation briefly faltering before resuming with renewed interest. A man stood from a corner table, nodding respectfully in her direction. Samuel Garrett was not what she expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, yes, as frontier life demanded, but there was an unexpected gentleness in his stance, a careful distance kept as she approached. His clothes were practical but clean, his beard neatly trimmed. It was his eyes that caught her attention most, deep blue and thoughtful, studying her with interest rather than judgment. "Miss Montgomery," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "For a man of his stature, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. May I offer you a seat?" As Josephine sat across from this stranger, she couldn't know that this unexpected meeting would change the course of her life, that this quiet rancher harbored secrets and talents as out of place in Silverdale as her own. She only knew that. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, someone was looking at her without pity or dismissal. "Mr. Garrett," she acknowledged cautiously, "I'm told you wish to speak with me about my situation." "I heard about what happened with Douglas Harrington," Samuel said, signaling to the barkeep for 2 cups of coffee. "News travels fast in small towns." Josephine straightened her spine. "I'm sure the entire settlement is thoroughly entertained by my misfortune." A flicker of understanding crossed Samuel's face. "Folks here are curious about newcomers, especially those who arrive under unusual circumstances. But that's not why I'm here." The barkeep set down 2 steaming mugs. Samuel nodded his thanks before continuing. "I manage the Pinewood Ranch, about 7 miles north of town. It's a cattle operation primarily, but—" He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I find myself in need of assistance of a different nature than most ranches require." Josephine wrapped her fingers around the warm mug, skepticism evident in her arched eyebrow. "What sort of assistance could I possibly provide, Mr. Garrett? As was made abundantly clear today, my skills are ill-suited for frontier life, perhaps for Harrington's operation. Mine is different." Samuel leaned forward slightly. "I have a daughter, Miss Montgomery. Charlotte is 12 years old and bright as the morning star, but she's had little formal education beyond what I could provide." "You're offering me a position as a governess?" Josephine asked, surprise evident in her voice. "In a manner of speaking, Charlotte needs proper schooling in literature, mathematics, and, yes, music if possible. I've taught her what I can, but she deserves more." Josephine studied him carefully. His hands were those of a working man, calloused and strong, yet he held his coffee cup with unexpected grace. There was something in his manner that didn't quite align with the other frontier men she'd encountered. "Why me? Surely there are teachers in town who—" "None with your qualifications," he interrupted gently. "Mrs. Jenkins mentioned you taught music in Boston. Charlotte has a natural talent that deserves nurturing by someone who understands it." The offer was unexpected, almost too perfectly aligned with her predicament. Josephine's years in Boston had taught her to be wary of convenient solutions. And what exactly would this arrangement entail, Mr. Garrett? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Room and board at the ranch, a fair monthly wage, and transportation back to town whenever you wish. You would have teaching responsibilities 5 days weekly, with your own quarters separate from the main house. He paused, then added, "I understand your hesitation. It's a proposition from a stranger in a strange place." Josephine glanced around the saloon. Several patrons were watching their conversation with undisguised interest. Her options were painfully limited. Board tomorrow's stage, with barely enough money for passage and no destination, or accept this unexpected proposition. "How do I know you're trustworthy?" she asked bluntly. Samuel's mouth curved in what might have been appreciation for her directness. "Ask Mrs. Jenkins, or Sheriff Ellis. I've lived in this territory for 15 years without complaint." "And what of Charlotte's mother?" A shadow passed over his features. "Caroline passed 6 years ago. Influenza." Josephine softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss. As am I for the poor welcome you've received. Silverdale can be rough-edged, but not everyone here values only practical skills. Some of us recognize that culture and education are what separates civilization from mere survival." Something in his words resonated with her. Josephine took a deliberate sip of coffee, considering her limited options. "I would need to know more about your expectations, and I would want to meet Charlotte before agreeing to anything." "Of course." Relief flickered across Samuel's face. "I'm in town for supplies today. We could depart tomorrow, instead of you taking the stage east. You could meet Charlotte, see the ranch, and then decide. If it's not suitable, I'll personally ensure you have passage to Denver on the next coach." It was a reasonable offer, more than reasonable. Yet Josephine hesitated, the sting of her earlier rejection still fresh. "And if I prove too cultured for ranch life as well?" "What then?" Samuel met her gaze steadily. "Miss Montgomery, I didn't seek you out despite your education and refinement. I sought you out because of it." Their conversation continued as evening deepened, Samuel explaining more about Charlotte, a bright girl who devoured the few books they owned, who fashioned a makeshift piano keyboard from paper when Samuel couldn't afford a real instrument. By the time they parted ways, Josephine had provisionally agreed to visit Pinewood Ranch the following day. Sleep came fitfully that night. Doubts crept in with the small hours. Was she making another mistake? Trading one uncertain future for another? By the time dawn streaked the sky with pink and gold, Josephine had resolved to proceed cautiously, to see this ranch and meet this child before committing to anything. Samuel arrived promptly at 9 with a wagon already loaded with supplies. He helped Josephine with her valise, treating the worn leather with respect rather than disdain. "It's not a difficult journey," he explained as they left the town behind. "But the terrain gets rougher once we leave the main road." The landscape opened before them as they traveled, vast and beautiful in its rugged way, so different from Boston's manicured commons and crowded streets. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still snow-capped despite the summer heat. Wildflowers dotted the prairie in splashes of color. "It's breathtaking," Josephine admitted. Breaking a long silence, Samuel nodded. "That was my first thought when I came west. The second was terror at how I'd survive in such wilderness. Yet you did. Adaptation is a powerful instinct." He glanced at her. "The frontier changes people, Miss Montgomery. Sometimes in ways they never anticipated." The wagon crested a hill, and Samuel drew the horses to a gentle stop. "Pinewood Ranch," he said simply, gesturing ahead. Below them stretched a valley, cradled by pine-covered hills. A sturdy two-story house stood near its center, flanked by a large barn and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and a stream wound through the property like a silver ribbon. It was modest compared to the grand estates of Massachusetts, yet there was an undeniable harmony to its layout. "You positioned the house to capture both sunrise and sunset," Josephine observed. Samuel looked at her with surprise. "Yes, few notice that." The wagon continued down the slope, and details emerged. Unlike many frontier homes built purely for function, the main house showed touches of care. Curtains in the windows, a small flower garden to one side, a covered porch with actual chairs rather than makeshift seating. As they approached, the front door burst open. A girl with copper-colored braids raced toward them, her calico dress billowing around sturdy boots. "Pa, you're back early," she called. then stopped short at the sight of Josephine. Caution immediately replaced excitement. Samuel smiled warmly. "Charlotte, this is Miss Montgomery from Boston, the teacher I mentioned." Charlotte's eyes widened, traveling from Josephine's city clothes to her gloved hands. Her curtsy was unpracticed but sincere. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Montgomery." The girl's diction was careful, deliberate, as though demonstrating her best manners. "The pleasure is mine, Charlotte," Josephine replied, noting the intelligence in the girl's green eyes. "Your father speaks highly of your love for learning." Charlotte darted a glance at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. "Do you really know how to play piano? A real one, not just made-up ones?" "I do. I taught piano for 7 years in Boston." The girl's face lit up. "Pa's been saving for one. He says maybe by Christmas, if the cattle prices hold." Samuel cleared, his throat looking slightly embarrassed. "Charlotte, perhaps Miss Montgomery would like to refresh herself after our journey before you interrogate her about every instrument in existence." Charlotte flushed. "Sorry, Pa. Sorry, Miss Montgomery." "No apology needed," Josephine assured her. "Curiosity is the foundation of learning." As Samuel helped Josephine down from the wagon, she noted more details about the property: the careful maintenance of the buildings, the orderliness of tools and equipment. This was not a place of mere survival, but of purposeful living. A woman emerged from the house, grey-haired and sturdy, with a no-nonsense expression that softened when she saw Charlotte's excitement. "Mrs. Turner, our housekeeper," Samuel explained. "She comes 3 days a week from her own homestead nearby." The older woman nodded to Josephine, assessment clear in her eyes. "Your room's ready, miss. Hot water, too, if you're wanting to wash off the trail dust." "Thank you," Josephine said, surprised by this thoughtfulness. Samuel lifted her valise. "I'll show you to your quarters. They're attached to the main house but have a separate entrance. I thought you might appreciate the privacy." The accommodations were simple but carefully prepared. A bedroom with an actual bedstead and clean linens, a small sitting room with a desk and bookshelf, and a separate washroom. A vase of wildflowers sat on the windowsill, adding a touch of color. "It's not what you're accustomed to in Boston," Samuel said, setting down her valise, "but I hope it will be comfortable." Josephine moved to the window, which overlooked both the yard and the distant mountains. "It's more than I expected," she admitted honestly. "I'll leave you to settle in. Dinner is at 6. Tomorrow perhaps you could observe Charlotte's current lessons, see where she stands academically." As he turned to leave, Josephine found herself asking, "Mr. Garrett, why did you really seek me out?" "There must be women closer who could teach basic subjects." Samuel paused at the door. "When I heard Harrington reject you for being too cultured, too educated, I recognized something. This territory doesn't just need people who can tame the land. It needs those who can bring civilization to it, real civilization, with art and ideas." His expression grew distant. "I want Charlotte to have more choices than most women out here, to recognize beauty as well as practicality." With that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Josephine stood motionless, absorbing both his words and the reality of her new surroundings. This wasn't the future she had imagined when boarding the stagecoach in Boston. It wasn't even the future she had imagined yesterday morning. Yet, as she unpacked her few belongings, including the portrait of her parents, Josephine felt something she hadn't expected, a tentative sense of possibility. Whether it would blossom or wither remained to be seen, but for the moment it was enough. The first rays of sunrise filtered through the curtains, waking Josephine earlier than her Boston habits dictated. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. The unfamiliar ceiling, the distant lowing of cattle, the scent of pine carried on the morning breeze. Then reality settled in. Pinewood Ranch, her temporary position, a chance to regroup before deciding her next move. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, practical enough for a day of assessment, yet still maintaining the standards of her profession. Teaching had been her anchor in Boston. Perhaps it could be her lifeline here. The main house kitchen buzzed with morning activity. Charlotte was setting the table, while Samuel flipped hotcakes on a cast-iron griddle. The domesticity of the scene struck Josephine, so different from her solitary breakfasts in her Boston apartment. "Good morning, Miss Montgomery." Charlotte beamed. "Pa makes the best hotcakes in the territory on Tuesdays." Samuel glanced up, a hint of color touching his tanned face. "Charlotte exaggerates. They're edible, nothing more." "He's being modest," Charlotte stage whispered. "The secret is buttermilk." Josephine found herself smiling despite her lingering uncertainty. "Good morning to you both. Is there anything I can assist with?" "Just have a seat," Samuel replied, sliding a stack of golden brown hotcakes onto a serving plate. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Breakfast proved surprisingly pleasant. Charlotte chatted about the books she'd been reading, a mixture of practical guides and what few novels the ranch possessed. Samuel spoke little, but listened intently, occasionally redirecting his daughter's enthusiasm with gentle reminders about giving their guest space to eat. "I thought we might start with an assessment of Charlotte's current knowledge," Josephine suggested as they finished. "That would help me develop an appropriate curriculum." Samuel nodded. "The study is yours for the morning. I've worked in the north pasture but should return by midday. May I show Miss Montgomery my compositions first?" Charlotte asked eagerly. Samuel's expression softened with unmistakable pride. "If Miss Montgomery is agreeable." "Compositions?" Josephine inquired. "Music," Charlotte clarified, already bouncing from her chair. "I write them down like Pa taught me." Intrigued, Josephine followed the girl to a small room off the main sitting area. A scarred desk occupied one corner, its surface neatly arranged with papers, inkwells, and a collection of books ranging from practical manuals to, surprisingly, several volumes of poetry. Most remarkable, however, was the crude drawing of piano keys etched carefully onto a flat board, positioned at what would be playing height. Charlotte reverently removed several papers from a drawer, presenting them to Josephine with a mixture of pride and trepidation. "Pa says I need proper training to do it right, but I hear the music in my head." Josephine examined the pages with growing astonishment. Though the notation was unconventional, clearly self-taught from books rather than formal instruction, the girl had managed to create recognizable musical compositions, simple melodies with tempting harmonies, showing remarkable intuition despite the technical limitations. "Charlotte, this is—" Josephine searched for words that wouldn't overpraise, yet acknowledged the achievement. "This shows genuine aptitude. How did you learn notation?" The girl pointed to a worn book on the shelf. "Pa found that in Denver last spring. Before that, I just made up my own markings." Josephine glanced toward the doorway, where Samuel stood quietly observing, his expression unreadable. "You taught yourself musical notation from a book?" "Some," he admitted. "Enough to help." Charlotte with the basics. The revelation shifted something in Josephine's understanding of this rancher. Most men of her acquaintance, even in cultured Boston, wouldn't have bothered learning musical notation, particularly not for a daughter's benefit. Morning stretched into afternoon as Josephine assessed Charlotte's education level. The girl proved advanced in reading and mathematics, with gaps in formal grammar and science. Most surprising was her knowledge of art history, limited but surprisingly specific. "Your father taught you about Renaissance painters?" Josephine asked, puzzled by Charlotte's detailed description of Botticelli's techniques. "From his books. We study the pictures together on Sundays, when it's too stormy for church." Each revelation added another layer to the mystery of Samuel Garrett, a cattle rancher who recognized Botticelli, who taught himself musical notation. The contradiction fascinated her. When Samuel returned from his work, Josephine requested a private conversation. They walked to the edge of the garden, the house still visible, but their words private. "Your daughter is remarkably well educated in certain areas," Josephine began. "Though there are gaps we should address." Samuel nodded. "I've done what I could, but my own education has limitations." "About that," Josephine ventured cautiously, "Charlotte mentioned art history lessons. Renaissance painters aren't typical frontier education." A shadow crossed his face. "Does that concern you?" "No, it intrigues me. You're not what you appear to be, Mr. Garrett." He studied the distant mountains for a long moment. "Few of us are exactly as we appear, Miss Montgomery. You arrived in Silverdale expecting to be valued for your domestic capabilities rather than your cultural refinement. I simply recognize that both have worth." The days fell into a rhythm as summer deepened. Mornings devoted to Charlotte's lessons, afternoons split between teaching preparation and Josephine's gradual integration into ranch operations. Not the heavy labor. Samuel employed 2 ranch hands for that, but learning the flow of life in this place is so different from her urban existence. Mrs. Turner proved an unexpected ally, patiently demonstrating practical skills without condescension. "City folk think we're all ignorant out here," she remarked one afternoon while teaching Josephine to preserve blackberries they'd gathered. "But there's different kinds of knowledge. You're smart enough to know that." Josephine's evenings remained her own. Sometimes she read from Samuel's surprisingly extensive library. Other evenings she spent writing detailed letters to her few remaining connections in Boston, letters that described the breathtaking landscape but remained carefully vague about her circumstances. 3 weeks after her arrival, Samuel approached. As she sat on the porch, watching twilight paint the mountains in purple shadow. "Charlotte mentioned you've been writing music exercises for her," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "She has genuine talent. It seems criminal not to nurture it, even without a proper instrument." Samuel nodded, something unspoken lingering in his expression. "Would you join us in the study after Charlotte retires tonight? There's something I'd like to show you." Curiosity piqued. Josephine agreed. When Charlotte had been sent to bed with a kiss from her father and a reminder from Josephine about tomorrow's grammar lesson, Samuel led the way to the study. He closed the door quietly behind them. "What I'm about to show you isn't something I share with many people," he said, a hint of vulnerability in his voice that she hadn't heard before. "Charlotte knows, of course, and Mrs. Turner. No one else." From a cabinet locked with a small key, Samuel withdrew several leather portfolios, placing them carefully on the desk. "These are why I recognize the value in what Douglas Harrington." "Dismissed." Josephine opened the first portfolio and gasped softly. Inside were exquisite drawings, landscapes rendered with technical precision yet undeniable artistic sensibility. Mountains, forests, rivers captured in perfect detail. She turned page after page, each revealing another scene of Western beauty transformed through artistic vision. "These are remarkable," she breathed. "You created these?" Samuel nodded, a combination of pride and uncertainty in his stance. "Art was my first love, before cattle, before ranching. Then how... My father was a Philadelphia banker who considered artistic pursuits suitable only for women and Europeans," Samuel explained, his voice matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "I was expected to follow him into finance. When he discovered my drawings, he burned them and arranged a position for me at his bank." Josephine winced. "That's monstrous." "It was conventional. I endured 3 years before leaving everything behind. Came west with nothing but determination to live differently." He hesitated, then added softly, "I promised myself my own child would never face such limitations." "So you built all this?" Josephine gestured, encompassing not just the room, but the entire ranch beyond. A different kind of life. One where practicality and beauty don't have to be enemies. He opened another portfolio. These are my more recent works. These drawings showed people, Charlotte at various ages, Mrs. Turner kneading bread, ranch hands with horses, simple moments rendered with compassion and insight. The final image made Josephine catch her breath, herself sitting on the porch. At sunset, her profile thoughtful as she gazed toward the mountains. "You've been drawing me?" she asked, uncertain whether to feel flattered or invaded. "Forgive me if that's presumptuous. Artists capture what moves them." His voice lowered. "Your arrival has brought something to this house that was missing. Not just education for Charlotte, but, she prompted when he fell silent. Understanding, someone who sees value in both worlds, the moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Josephine carefully closed the portfolio, gathering her composure. "Why show me this now?" Samuel met her gaze directly. "Because you've stayed 3 weeks longer than the visit we initially discussed. Because Charlotte is flourishing under your guidance. Because I thought you deserved to know the truth about who I am before deciding whether to remain longer." He was offering more than continued employment, Josephine realized. He was offering trust, showing her the part of himself he kept hidden from the world, the cultured soul beneath the rancher's exterior. "I should consider this carefully," she said finally. "Of course." Samuel stepped back, respecting her space. "Take whatever time you need." That night, Josephine sat by her window long after the ranch had gone silent. The moonlight silvered the landscape, transforming the familiar daytime view into something magical and new, like seeing beneath the surface to a hidden truth. In Boston, she had been valued for her ability to teach young ladies the refined arts expected of their station. Here, in this unlikely place, she was valued for something more fundamental, her understanding of how culture and beauty enriched life rather than detracted from it, how they could exist alongside practical concerns rather than in opposition. For the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, Josephine felt something shift within her, the beginning of belonging. Autumn touched the Colorado landscape with a painter's brush. Aspen groves transformed into shimmering gold, prairie grasses burnished copper, evening skies deepening to indigo. Nearly 3 months had passed since Josephine's arrival at Pinewood Ranch, the temporary arrangement evolving into something undefined yet increasingly permanent. Charlotte's education progressed remarkably. The girl's natural intelligence, nurtured by Josephine's structured guidance, blossomed beyond expectations. Their lessons now extended beyond basic subjects into French vocabulary, music theory, and literary analysis. Ambitious for a 12-year-old, but Charlotte absorbed knowledge with insatiable enthusiasm. More surprising was the transformation in Josephine herself. Her hands, once exclusively dedicated to piano keys and penmanship, now moved confidently through practical tasks, gathering eggs without hesitation, kneading bread alongside Mrs. Turner, even helping with the autumn apple harvest. Not from necessity, but from a growing appreciation for the integration of beauty and utility that defined life at Pinewood. The ranch's isolation had become a sanctuary rather than a limitation. Weekly trips to Silverdale for supplies or mail provided sufficient connection to the wider world. Occasional social gatherings, harvest celebrations, or church socials offered community without the scrutiny Josephine had initially feared. Most townsfolk had accepted her presence as Charlotte's governess without question, her connection to the rejected mail-order arrangement fading into background gossip. On a crisp October morning, Josephine accompanied Samuel and Charlotte to Silverdale for the town's annual harvest festival. The wagon bounced along the now familiar road, Charlotte chattering excitedly about the pie competition, while Samuel and Josephine exchanged amused glances over her enthusiasm. Their relationship had evolved into comfortable companionship, deepened by evening conversations about books, art, and ideas after Charlotte went to bed. Samuel had gradually shared more of his artwork, even teaching Josephine basic sketching techniques. She, in turn, had begun composing simple piano pieces for Charlotte, using the crude wooden keyboard for demonstration until a real instrument could be acquired. Something unspoken yet tangible had grown between them, a connection based on mutual respect and shared understanding. Neither had put words to it, both conscious of their unconventional situation, yet both increasingly aware of its significance. "Mrs. Turner says the general store received new fabric shipments," Charlotte announced as Silverdale came into view. "Can we look, Pa? Miss Montgomery needs a new dress for winter." "Charlotte," Josephine admonished gently, "my wardrobe is perfectly adequate." Samuel's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I believe what my daughter is attempting to suggest, with her usual subtlety, is that we might purchase fabric as a gift." "Your birthday is next week, is it not?" Josephine looked at him in surprise. "How did you mentioned it to Charlotte during your lesson on calendar calculations." His expression remained casual, but something in his voice suggested the date had been deliberately remembered. The town square bustled with festival preparations, bunting strung between buildings, tables arranged for food displays, children racing excitedly through the crowd. Samuel secured the wagon near the livery before they joined the festivities. "Let's meet at noon by the gazebo," Samuel suggested. "I have business at the bank, and I suspect you two have shopping plans regardless of protests about adequate wardrobes." Charlotte tugged at Josephine's hand, eager to explore the merchant stalls. Josephine allowed herself to be led through the crowd, enjoying the girls' excitement. They examined fabric at the general store, admired handcrafted jewelry at a traveling peddler's stall, and sampled fresh apple cider from a local orchard. "Miss Montgomery," the familiar voice halted Josephine mid-step. She turned slowly to face Douglas Harrington, impeccably dressed as always, standing with a petite blonde woman whose fashionable attire marked her as recently arrived from the East. "Mr. Harrington," Josephine acknowledged coolly, instinctively, placing a protective hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "I'd heard you found employment with Garrett." His gaze swept over her, noting the subtle changes in her appearance, the simpler hairstyle, the practical boots beneath her still proper dress. "Teaching his half-wild daughter, is it?" Charlotte stiffened beside her. Josephine squeezed her shoulder gently. "Charlotte is one of the brightest students I've ever taught, hardly half-wild." The woman beside Douglas stepped forward, curiosity evident in her expression. "Douglas, won't you introduce us?" He cleared his throat. "Of course. Miss Josephine Montgomery, my wife, Rebecca Harrington." Rebecca arrived from Baltimore just last month. Understanding dawned. Douglas had found another mail-order bride, one whose appearance or background better suited his requirements. The blonde woman's expensive clothing and delicate features projected exactly the image of refinement Douglas had claimed to disdain. "Pleasure to meet you," Josephine said, managing a polite nod despite the irony. "This is Charlotte Garrett, my student, Rebecca," smiled warmly, seemingly unaware of the tension. "Douglas mentioned there was another Eastern lady who briefly visited Silverdale. How fortunate you found a position that utilizes your education." Before Josephine could respond, Douglas interjected, "Rebecca teaches piano to several ladies in town. She's brought true culture to our community." The deliberate barb wasn't lost on Josephine, but she maintained her composure. "How lovely! Charlotte has considerable musical talent herself," Douglas scoffed. "Out at Garrett's place? Unlikely." "My pa knows more about music and art than anyone," Charlotte declared loyally, her young voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. "Your Ipa is a cattle rancher," Douglas corrected with patronizing gentleness. "A competent one, I'll grant, but hardly cultured." You know very little about Mr. Garrett, Josephine stated, ice crystallizing around each word. Douglas leaned closer, lowering his voice. I know he took in Boston's cast-offs when no one else would. Tell me, Miss Montgomery, does he keep you in that little attached room, or have arrangements progressed to more comfortable accommodations? Heat rushed to Josephine's cheeks. Not from embarrassment, but from indignation. Mr. Harrington, you forget yourself. Do I? The town wonders why Garrett suddenly needed a governess when he's managed his daughter's education for years. Some wonder if he's seeking more than teaching services. That's enough. Samuel's voice, dangerously quiet, came from behind Douglas. Apologize to Miss Montgomery and my daughter. Douglas turned, his momentary surprise quickly masked by bravado. Garrett, just discussing your domestic arrangements. You were insulting a lady in my employ and implying impropriety where none exists. Samuel's posture remained relaxed, but something in his eyes made Douglas step back. No insult intended, Douglas backpedaled. Merely town curiosity. Rebecca Harrington looked between them, confusion evident. Douglas, what's happening? Nothing of consequence, my dear. Douglas took his wife's arm. We should continue our rounds. Good day, Garrett, Miss Montgomery. As they walked away, Rebecca glanced back, her expression puzzled and slightly concerned. Josephine exhaled slowly, the confrontation leaving her unexpectedly shaken. Are you all right? Samuel asked. Quietly. Of course, she replied automatically, then amended with honesty. No, his insinuations were inappropriate, especially in front of Charlotte. Samuel nodded, his jaw tight. Charlotte, would you please wait for us at the gazebo? Just for a moment. Once, Charlotte had reluctantly moved out of earshot. Samuel turned to Josephine. I'm sorry you faced that. Harrington's always been more concerned with appearances than substance. The irony being he rejected me for lacking practical skills, then married someone who embodies the very refinement he claimed to despise in me. Josephine shook her head. Though she seems kind enough. Some men want trophies, not partners. Samuel's voice softened. What troubles me is the town gossip he referenced. Josephine met his gaze directly. Does it trouble you for my reputation or your own? Yours. I've lived here long enough to weather gossip. He hesitated. But perhaps we should discuss the future of our arrangement. 3 months have passed. You originally came for a temporary visit. The festival crowd continued around them. But Josephine felt suddenly isolated, as if their conversation existed, in a bubble, separate from the cheerful chaos. Are you suggesting I should leave? The possibility created an unexpected hollow feeling. No. The word came quickly, definitively. I'm suggesting we clarify what you wish for your future. Charlotte needs you. The ranch has, he paused, searching for words, become more than a ranch since your arrival. Before Josephine could respond, a commotion near the judging tables drew attention. Douglas Harrington's voice carried across. The square, words indistinct, but tone unmistakably condescending. To Josephine's horror, she realized he was speaking to Charlotte, who stood rigid before the pie competition table, tears threatening despite her obvious effort to maintain composure. Samuel moved immediately, Josephine close behind. As they approached, Douglas's words became clear. Hardly appropriate for a child to enter an adult competition, especially with such unconventional methods. Pies require traditional techniques, not experimental approaches. Charlotte's voice trembled, but remained steady. Miss Montgomery helped me adapt my grandmother's recipe. Just because it looks different doesn't mean it isn't good. The competition has standards, Douglas insisted. Rebecca's entry follows. Proper Boston traditions. Samuel reached his daughter's side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Is there a problem with Charlotte's entry? The head judge, Mrs. Peterson, looked uncomfortable. Not exactly, Mr. Garrett. It's just unusual. The lavender and honey combination, the lattice pattern. Innovation isn't a flaw, Josephine interjected, studying Charlotte's creation. The pie featured an intricate lattice design, unlike the traditional patterns, almost musical in its rhythmic arrangement. True innovation requires proper foundation. Douglas argued, something lacking in Charlotte's education. The barb was aimed at both Josephine and Samuel. Around them, festival-goers paused, sensing drama unfolding. Samuel remained calm, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. My daughter's education includes respect for others and appreciation of beauty in all forms, qualities that seem increasingly rare. Douglas stepped closer. Some might say her education has become unnecessarily ornamental since Miss Montgomery's arrival. Reading French poetry won't help her survive frontier winters, and empty social pretensions won't build anything of lasting value, Samuel countered, his voice still measured but carrying an edge. Charlotte's pie represents who we are at Pinewood, respectful of tradition but unafraid of creating something new. Rebecca Harrington appeared beside her husband, her expression mortified. Douglas, please, this is hardly an appropriate discussion for a community celebration. For a moment, tension crackled between the men. Then Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat. The judging will proceed according to taste and execution, not appearance alone. All entries will receive fair consideration. Douglas adjusted his vest, confidence slightly dented. Of course. Come, Rebecca. Let's allow the judges to do their work. As they walked away, Charlotte blinked back tears. I shouldn't have entered. No, Josephine said firmly. Your pie is beautiful and thoughtful. Never apologize for creating something unique. Samuel's gaze followed Douglas through the crowd, something unresolved in his expression. The confrontation had exposed a deeper conflict, not just between two men, but between competing visions of what belonged in this evolving frontier community. Josephine realized with sudden clarity that they stood at a crossroads. The comfortable existence they'd built at Pinewood now faced external scrutiny and judgment. How they responded would define their future, separately or together. The remainder of the festival passed in a haze of forced smiles and polite conversation. Josephine found herself hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered comment as they moved through the crowd. Samuel remained close, his presence both reassuring and complicated. Charlotte's initial excitement had dimmed, though she brightened considerably when her pie received an honorable mention for most innovative design. As they prepared to depart late afternoon, Rebecca Harrington approached their wagon alone, glancing over her shoulder to ensure her husband was occupied elsewhere. Miss Montgomery, she said softly, I wanted to apologize for Douglas's behavior. He can be traditional in his views. Josephine arranged Charlotte's festival prizes in the wagon bed, choosing her words carefully. No apology necessary, Mrs. Harrington. You aren't responsible for your husband's opinions. Rebecca twisted her gloved hands nervously. I also wanted to ask about the piano lessons. Douglas mentioned you taught in Boston. For 7 years at the Winthrop Academy for Young Ladies. I've been attempting to establish a small music circle here, but it's challenging without another trained musician for guidance. Rebecca's eyes held genuine admiration. Would you consider joining us? Perhaps once a month. I could compensate you, of course. The request caught Josephine off guard. I'm not certain that would be appropriate given the circumstances. Please, consider it. Douglas has his opinions, but Rebecca glanced again toward her husband, who was now watching them with narrowed eyes from across the square. I find Silverdale lacking in artistic companionship. Samuel approached, nodding politely to Rebecca. Mrs. Harrington, Mr. Garrett, you have a lovely daughter. Her musical compositions show remarkable promise. Samuel's surprise was evident. You've seen Charlotte's work. She showed me her notation while Douglas was discussing the pie competition. I'd recognize talent anywhere, Mr. Garrett. You should be proud. With that, Rebecca hurried away to rejoin her husband, leaving both Samuel and Josephine momentarily speechless. "Well," Samuel finally said, helping Josephine onto the wagon seat, "that was unexpected." The journey home began in contemplative silence, Charlotte eventually dozing against Josephine's shoulder as the wagon rumbled along the familiar road. The earlier confrontation hung between them, demanding acknowledgement, yet resisting simple resolution. "You never answered my question," Samuel said finally, his eyes on the trail ahead. "About your future plans." Josephine watched the landscape pass, autumn colors deepening in the late afternoon light. "I hadn't planned beyond today, truthfully. When I first arrived in Colorado, everything was arranged. Marriage to a stranger, a predefined role. When that collapsed, I stopped making long-term plans. And now I find myself caring deeply about Charlotte's education, about the garden. I've started behind the kitchen, about your artwork." She paused, gathering courage. "About our evening conversations." Samuel's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Douglas's insinuations today, they weren't entirely without foundation in town gossip. People question why you remained. "Do you question it?" "No." His answer came without hesitation. "I understand precisely why you stayed. The same reason I did, all those years ago. Finding a place where you're valued for who you truly are is rare. When you find it, you hold on." The wagon crested the final hill before Pinewood Ranch came into view. Samuel drew the horses to a stop, the vista spreading before them. The house, gleaming in late afternoon light, smoke curling from the chimney where Mrs. Turner would be preparing supper, the mountains rising majestically beyond. "What Harrington said about the town talking, it won't stop," Samuel said quietly. "Not while our arrangement remains undefined." "What are you suggesting?" Samuel turned to face her directly, careful not to disturb Charlotte's slumber. "I came west to build a life without pretense or false constraints. I've tried to give Charlotte the same freedom, but I've realized something these past months." Josephine waited, heart unexpectedly racing. "Freedom without connection is incomplete. What we've built at Pinewood, your lessons with Charlotte, our discussions about books and art, even Mrs. Turner's grudging approval of your preserves, it's become something I never expected to find again after Caroline died." "A family," Josephine said softly. "Yes." Samuel's gaze held hers steadily. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer, but I am asking you to consider whether your future might be here permanently, not as Charlotte's governess, but as her mother. As my wife." The directness of the proposal, without flowery declarations or romantic pretense, somehow felt perfectly suited to their relationship, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than conventional courtship. "This isn't about silencing town gossip," he added quickly. "Though it would. It's about acknowledging what already exists between us." Charlotte stirred against Josephine's shoulder, mumbling sleepily. The moment for immediate response passed, but Samuel's question lingered in the air between them as he clicked the reins, guiding the wagon down the final stretch toward home. Home. The word resonated in Josephine's mind as Pinewood's buildings drew closer. When had she begun thinking of this place as home? Sometime between Charlotte's music lessons and Samuel's quiet revelations about his art. Between learning to preserve summer fruits and discovering that ranch life could accommodate both practical skills and cultural pursuits. As they approached the house, Josephine noted a horse tied at the hitching post, unfamiliar, with quality tack suggesting a visitor of means. "Were you expecting someone?" she asked. Samuel frowned. "No." Charlotte awakened fully as the wagon stopped in the yard. A man emerged from the porch shadows, tall, distinguished, his Eastern-cut suit incongruous against the frontier backdrop. "Samuel." "Garrett," the stranger called, approaching the wagon. Yes. Samuel helped Charlotte down, positioning himself slightly in front of his daughter and Josephine. Walter Montgomery, attorney at law. The man extended his hand, then froze, his gaze, moving to Josephine. Good Lord! Josephine! Josephine Montgomery! Josephine stared at the stranger, confusion giving way to stunned recognition. Uncle Walter! Samuel looked between them. You know this man? My father's brother, Josephine explained, descending from the wagon on unsteady legs, though we haven't spoken in years. Walter Montgomery removed his hat, revealing grey-streaked hair and features that echoed Josephine's own refined bone structure. I've been searching for you for months. When your letters to the Winthrop Academy stopped, they contacted me. I've been following your trail since Boston. Why? Josephine asked, genuine bewilderment in her voice. You made your opinion of my career choice quite clear after my parents died. Walter had the grace to look uncomfortable. Circumstances have changed. Your grandfather Montgomery passed away in July. His will specified that his art collection and a considerable portion of his estate should pass to you, his only grandchild, who understood the value of cultural heritage, as he put it. The news struck Josephine like a physical blow. Her grandfather had been a distant figure in her childhood, a wealthy collector whose approval her father had never managed to secure. That he had remembered her at all was surprising. I don't understand. He never showed any particular interest in my welfare during his life. He followed your career from a distance. Apparently, he approved of your independence. Walter glanced around the ranch yard. Though I doubt he envisioned you here. Samuel stepped forward. Mr. Montgomery, you've had a long journey. Please join us for supper. We can discuss this matter comfortably inside. Walter nodded, his assessment of Samuel clearly questioning but civil. Thank you. That would be welcome. As they moved toward the house, Samuel touched Josephine's elbow gently. Are you all right? She nodded, though her mind whirled with implications. Her grandfather's inheritance represented not just wealth, but options. A return to the world she'd left behind, legitimacy in the circles she'd once inhabited. The timing, coming hours after Samuel's tentative proposal, seemed almost deliberately orchestrated by fate. Charlotte, sensing the tension, slipped her hand into Josephine's. Is that really your uncle? Does this mean you have family after all? Yes, Josephine answered softly. It appears I do. The question that remained unspoken as they entered the house hung heavily in her heart. Which family would she choose? The one connected by blood and cultural heritage, or the one formed through understanding and acceptance on this remote Colorado ranch? Dinner that evening unfolded with the strained politeness of uncertain allegiances. Mrs. Turner, sensing the tension, produced her finest meal, venison stew with dumplings, fresh-baked bread, and the season's last blackberry preserves. Walter Montgomery ate appreciatively while studying his surroundings with the careful assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating worth. Your home is surprisingly civilized, Mr. Garrett, Walter observed, noting the bookshelves lining one wall, the modest but tasteful furnishings. The frontier isn't uniformly primitive despite Eastern assumptions, Samuel replied evenly. Many of us value comfort and culture alongside practicality. Charlotte, subdued but curious, watched her teacher's uncle with unconcealed fascination. Did you bring any pictures of Josephine's family, or Boston? She's told me about the public. Garden and the swan boats, Walter smiled, a genuine expression that softened his formal demeanor. Not with me, unfortunately. But the Montgomery home in Beacon Hill contains numerous family portraits. Perhaps someday you might visit. Samuel's fork paused momentarily. Josephine noticed the slight tension in his hand before he resumed eating, his expression carefully. Neutral. After Charlotte reluctantly retired for the night, the adults gathered in Samuel's study. Walter accepted a glass of brandy, his gaze drawn immediately to the books lining the shelves. Volumes of poetry, philosophy, and art history interspersed, with practical manuals on ranching and agriculture. An eclectic collection, he noted, Emerson alongside guides to cattle breeding. Life here requires both thought and action, Samuel responded. Please, Mr. Montgomery, explain the purpose of your journey, beyond delivering news of an inheritance. Walter settled into a chair, legal training evident in his measured speech. My brother James, Josephine's father, and I had significant disagreements regarding life priorities. He chose academia over joining the family banking interests, a decision our father never forgave. When James married a musician rather than the daughter of our father's business associate, the break became complete. Josephine's throat tightened. Her parents' history had seldom been discussed during her childhood. Their focus had been on building a life of intellectual and artistic pursuit rather than dwelling on family rifts. When they died, Walter continued, I attempted to guide Josephine toward more practical pursuits than music teaching. She refused my counsel. We parted on difficult terms. You called my chosen profession a frivolous waste of potential. Josephine reminded him quietly. Walter had the grace to look abashed. I was wrong. Your grandfather recognized what I didn't, that pursuing cultural education took courage in a society that increasingly values only commercial success. He drew a thick envelope from his jacket. When he died, he left specific instructions. His art collection, valued at over $50,000, along with liquid assets of approximately $30,000, are now yours. The sum hung in the air, its magnitude almost incomprehensible in this setting, where a good cattle season might yield a few thousand in profit. There are conditions, Walter added. The collection must be maintained intact and displayed appropriately. Grandfather believed art belongs where it can educate and inspire. He specified the funds be used to establish a cultural institution, a gallery, a school of arts, whatever form you deem suitable. In Boston? Josephine asked. Not necessarily. His will states, wherever Josephine Montgomery chooses to build. Her legacy. Samuel remained silent, though his knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped his glass. Walter leaned forward. I've secured temporary holding of the collection. However, decisions must be made promptly. Properties in Boston suitable for such an institution are currently available, but won't remain so indefinitely. The implication was clear. This opportunity required Josephine's return east. What remained unspoken was whether that return would be temporary or permanent. I need time to consider, Josephine said finally. Of course. However, I must return to Boston within the week. The executors require decisions by month's end. Walter glanced between Josephine and Samuel, perception sharpening his gaze. I sense my arrival has complicated existing arrangements. My relationship with Miss Montgomery and my daughter is not something I discuss with strangers, Samuel stated quietly but firmly. Walter nodded, recognizing the boundary. Understandable. Yet as Josephine's closest living relative, I have concerns about her future security and fulfillment. This inheritance offers independence few women achieve. I've never lacked independence, Uncle Walter. Only recognition of its value. Josephine rose from her chair. It's been a long day for everyone. Perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow. After showing Walter to the guest room, Josephine found Samuel still in the study, standing before the window that overlooked the moonlit ranch yard. I won't keep you from your inheritance, he said without turning, or the opportunity it represents. Is that what you think concerns me? That you would prevent me from claiming my grandfather's bequest? Samuel turned, his expression conflicted. $80,000 builds a very different future than what I offered this afternoon on the hilltop. You believe I can be purchased with a larger bid." The words came sharper than intended. "No." He stepped closer. "I believe you're facing a legitimate choice between two worlds. Earlier today, I asked you to consider becoming part of this family permanently. Now you've been offered the chance to establish something significant in the world you came from, a world where your talents and education would never be questioned as too cultured." The raw honesty between them had always been their strength. Tonight, it exposed the painful truth they both recognized but hadn't voiced. Josephine stood at a crossroads that would determine not just her future, but Charlotte's, Samuel's, and potentially an artistic legacy that could benefit countless others. "I need to think," she said finally. "This isn't a decision to make hastily." When Josephine retired to her quarters, sleep proved elusive. The moon cast silver patterns across her quilt as she considered paths diverging before her. Boston, with its cultural richness and established society, or Pinewood, with its integration of beauty and practicality, its family forming around her. Dawn arrived with gunshots shattering the crisp morning air. Josephine bolted upright, momentarily disoriented, before another volley sent her rushing to the window. In the grey morning light, she could make out figures moving near the far pasture. Samuel and his ranch hands assembled in defensive positions, while riders approached from the eastern boundary. Hastily dressing, she emerged to find Walter on the porch, looking equally concerned. "What's happening?" he demanded. Mrs. Turner appeared from the kitchen, rifle in hand. "Cattle rustlers. Third time this month they've tried." Rustlers? Walter's urban experience hadn't prepared him for this aspect of frontier life. "Thieves," Mrs. Turner clarified shortly. "Been hitting ranches throughout the county. Samuel caught them in the act this time." Charlotte burst from the house, eyes wide with fear. "They're shooting at Pa!" Mrs. Turner guided the girl firmly back toward the door. "Your pa knows what he's doing. Inside now, both of you." "Not my place," Walter protested, though he stepped back from the porch railing as another shot rang out. "Is there anything we can do?" Josephine asked, torn between seeking shelter and offering assistance. "Pray they don't make it past the outer pasture," Mrs. Turner replied grimly. "Samuel won't let them near the house, but if they do—" She patted the rifle meaningfully. The next hour passed in excruciating slowness. Occasional gunfire punctuated the otherwise silent morning. Charlotte paced anxiously while Walter sat uncomfortably in the kitchen, clearly unsettled by violence so foreign to his Boston existence. Josephine alternated between comforting Charlotte and watching through windows for any sign of Samuel's return. When hoofbeats finally approached, Mrs. Turner positioned herself at the door, rifle ready. Relief washed over her weathered features. As Samuel appeared, disheveled but unhurt. "They're gone," he announced, dismounting wearily. "Took 3 calves, but we drove them off before they reached the main herd." "Anyone hurt?" Mrs. Turner asked. Jim took a graze to the arm. "Nothing serious. I sent him to town for the doctor just to be safe." Samuel entered the kitchen, his expression softening at the sight of Charlotte, who launched herself into his arms. "I'm fine, little songbird," he murmured into her hair. "Just dusty." Walter stood awkwardly, city propriety at odds with the raw emotion of the scene. "This happens often." "More frequently lately," Samuel acknowledged, accepting the coffee. Mrs. Turner pressed into his hand. "The railroad's coming. Land values are rising. Some see theft as easier than honest work." "You have no law enforcement?" Walter asked incredulously. "Sheriff's office is in Silverdale, 20 minutes away on a fast horse, if he's even there. When needed. Out here we mostly handle problems ourselves." The frank assessment visibly disturbed Walter, whose life had been shaped by Eastern institutions and established legal frameworks. Josephine recognized the clash of worldviews, the structured society of Boston versus the self-reliant necessity of frontier existence. Charlotte, help Mrs. Turner with breakfast, Samuel directed gently. I need to speak with Miss Montgomery. And Mr. Montgomery privately. In the study, Samuel didn't bother with pleasantries. The rustlers weren't random. They specifically targeted my breeding stock, the foundation of next year's herd. This wasn't opportunistic theft, it was deliberate sabotage. You have enemies? Walter asked. Everyone successful has competitors, Samuel replied. But this feels personal. Josephine's mind raced. Douglas Harrington. Samuel's expression darkened. Possibly. His banking connections give him influence with the Railroad Commission. If Pinewood became unviable as a ranch, the land would be available for development. Walter finished. Professional interest, momentarily overriding his discomfort. Classic speculation tactic. I can't prove it. Not yet. Samuel ran a hand through his dust-streaked hair. But I can protect what's mine. The possessive pronoun hung in the air, its meaning expanding beyond cattle and land to encompass the life he'd built, the family he hoped to secure. His gaze met Josephine's complex emotions passing between them. I apologize for this disruption to your discussions, he said finally. But it clarifies something important. What's that? Walter asked. The real choice Josephine faces isn't between culture and frontier life. It's between a world where art exists in isolated perfection and one where it must be defended alongside everything else of value. Samuel's voice strengthened with conviction. Your brother chose to pursue beauty and knowledge despite your father's disapproval. I suspect he understood that true culture isn't fragile. It's resilient, worth fighting for. With that, he excused himself to check on his men, leaving Josephine and Walter in thoughtful silence. He's not what I expected, Walter admitted eventually. When I tracked you to a cattle ranch, I assumed that I'd been reduced to desperate circumstances, Josephine finished, that I needed rescuing. Something like that. Walter studied her with new perception. Instead, I find you part of something unexpected. Before Josephine could respond, Charlotte burst into the room, her face pale with terror. Riders coming. Mrs. Turner says it's Mr. Harrington, and he's brought men with him. Through the window, Josephine could see a group of horsemen approaching, Douglas Harrington at their center, flanked by 4 rough-looking men whose hands rested too casually near their holstered weapons. Charlotte, go to the kitchen with Mrs. Turner, Josephine instructed calmly. Stay there until we call for you. The girl hesitated. But Pa, your father would want you safe, Josephine said firmly. Please, Charlotte. Once Charlotte had reluctantly departed, Josephine turned to Walter. This is not your conflict. You should remain inside. Her uncle straightened, Montgomery pride evident in his bearing. If this concerns you, it concerns me. I may not be a frontiersman, but I'm still capable of standing beside family. The simple declaration, acknowledging their relationship after years of estrangement, carried unexpected weight. Josephine nodded gratefully before moving toward the door. Outside, Samuel stood on the porch steps, his posture relaxed but watchful. 2 ranch hands had positioned themselves strategically near the barn, rifles visible but not yet raised. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Douglas and his men drew their horses to a stop several yards from the house. Bit early. For social calls, Harrington, Samuel called, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the casual greeting. Douglas dismounted smoothly, his city boots raising dust as he stepped forward. Unlike the rough men accompanying him, he wore a tailored suit and polished derby, dressed for business rather than violence, though the contradiction didn't diminish the threat. Not a social call, Garrett. Consider it community concern. Douglas smiled thinly. Several prominent citizens have expressed worries about your operation here. My ranch has stood for 15 years without causing concern, Samuel replied evenly. What's changed? Progress, Garrett. Silverdale is growing. The railroad spur will transform this region. Properties must be developed appropriately, not held back by outdated ventures. Douglas glanced deliberately toward the house, his gaze finding Josephine in the doorway. And there are questions about moral conditions at Pinewood that disturb respectable families. Josephine stepped forward, anger overriding caution. If you're implying impropriety, Mr. Harrington, say it plainly. Douglas was surprised. Miss Montgomery, still here, I see. I merely express concerns shared by the Ladies' Improvement Society. An unmarried woman residing with a widower and his impressionable daughter raises eyebrows. Hypocritical concerns from a man who rejected Miss Montgomery for being too cultured, then married someone remarkably similar, Samuel observed coldly. Your sudden moral outrage seems conveniently timed with your interest in my land. Douglas's facade slipped momentarily, revealing the calculation beneath. The rustlers hit you hard this morning, I hear. Unfortunate. First your breeding stock, now this. Ranching becomes financially untenable under such circumstances. The direct reference to the morning's attack confirmed Samuel's suspicions. So that's the game. Sabotage my ranch, then ride in offering salvation through a lowball purchase. I represent investors prepared to offer fair market value. Considering the circumstances, Douglas gestured expansively. This land has possibilities beyond cattle. The railroad needs warehousing, housing for workers. And who are these mysterious investors? Walter stepped forward. His Eastern attire and bearing drawings surprised attention from Douglas and his men. I don't believe we've been introduced, Douglas said stiffly. Walter Montgomery, attorney at law, Boston. Miss Montgomery's uncle and legal representative. Walter assumed the authoritative tone that had intimidated opposing counsel in Massachusetts courtrooms. I find your tactics legally questionable, Mr. Harrington. Coordinating theft of property to devalue land before acquisition could be construed as criminal conspiracy. Douglas's expression hardened. Bold accusations from an outsider with no standing here. Perhaps Sheriff Ellis would disagree, Samuel suggested, especially with witness testimony connecting this morning's rustlers to your bank. One of Douglas's men shifted nervously in his saddle. The movement wasn't lost on Douglas, whose confident smile faltered slightly. You have no proof of any connection, he insisted. The rustlers were paid with newly minted double eagles, Samuel replied calmly. The same currency your bank received in last month's shipment from Denver, distinctive, with that small mark on the rim that the Denver Mint is known for. Josephine realized Samuel was bluffing, creating a specific detail that might rattle a guilty accomplice. She watched the men behind Douglas, noting how one refused to meet Douglas's questioning glance. This is absurd, Douglas blustered, though. His confidence had visibly diminished. We came to make a business proposition, not face wild accusations. And yet you brought armed men to a business discussion, Walter observed dryly. Curious negotiating tactic. The standoff stretched taut as a fiddle string, the ranch hands inching closer to their employer, while Douglas's men awaited direction. Samuel remained unnervingly calm, his eyes never leaving Douglas's increasingly uncertain expression. The tension broke unexpectedly with the sound of approaching hoofbeats. All heads turned as a rider appeared. Rebecca Harrington, her horse lathered from hard riding, her face set with determination. "Douglas!" she called, dismounting in a most unladylike haste. "Stop this immediately!" Douglas's face contorted with fury and embarrassment. "Rebecca, what are you doing here? Go back to town." "No." Her voice carried surprising authority as she approached, ignoring the armed men entirely. "Sheriff Ellis is on his way. I've informed him about the missing bank, funds, and your meetings with those rustlers." The color drained from Douglas's face. "You're confused, my dear. These are business associates." "No, I heard everything last night," Rebecca interrupted. "Your conversation with Mr. Jenkins about eliminating Garrett's breeding stock, about acquiring his land for the Railroad Commission in exchange for the president's position at the new territorial bank." Douglas stepped toward her, voice lowered threateningly. "You've lost your mind. No one will believe—" "I believe her," came a new voice. Sheriff Ellis rode into the yard, flanked by 2 deputies. "Mrs. Harrington provided some mighty interesting documentation this morning. Bank ledgers showing unauthorized withdrawals, names and dates that match recent rustling incidents." The men accompanying Douglas exchanged nervous glances, hands drifting away from their weapons as the deputies dismounted, with rifles at the ready. "This is preposterous," Douglas protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "My wife is clearly unwell." "Your wife," Rebecca cut in coldly, "is tired of watching you destroy people's lives for personal gain. Tired of pretending cultural refinement while lacking basic moral refinement." The pronouncement hung in the air, its accuracy striking Josephine forcefully. Douglas Harrington had rejected her for being too cultured, while craving exactly the status and refinement she represented. He had married Rebecca for her accomplishments, then resented the very qualities he had sought. His entire life was a contradiction, pursuing wealth and power while despising those who possessed the cultural depth he secretly envied. Sheriff Ellis stepped forward. "Mr. Harrington, I'm placing you under arrest, pending investigation into conspiracy to commit theft and fraud, your associates as well." As the deputies moved to secure Douglas and his increasingly reluctant men, Rebecca approached Josephine and Samuel, her composure remarkably intact despite the circumstances. "I owe you both an apology," she said quietly. "I suspected Douglas's dealings weren't entirely honorable, but I never imagined the extent until yesterday. After our conversation at the festival, I began questioning things I'd previously ignored." "You took considerable risk," Samuel acknowledged with newfound respect. Rebecca smiled sadly. "Perhaps I'm not as decorative and useless as my husband believed. Cultural education teaches ethics and courage alongside music and literature." As Douglas was led away, his furious protests fading into the distance, Josephine found herself standing between 2 worlds. Walter representing her Boston heritage, Samuel embodying her Pinewood present, and Rebecca demonstrating that true refinement transcended location or circumstance. The confrontation she had sensed building since yesterday's festival had arrived and resolved, not through violence, but through moral clarity. What remained was the most profound decision, not just about her future, but about what truly constituted the culture worth preserving and where it could best flourish. The aftermath of Douglas Harrington's arrest left Silverdale in upheaval. The bank temporarily closed pending investigation. Prominent citizens suddenly distanced themselves from their former associate, and Rebecca Harrington faced an uncertain future as her husband awaited trial in the Denver Territorial Court. At Pinewood Ranch, life settled into an uneasy calm. The rustling threat eliminated, Samuel and his hands focused on securing the remaining cattle and assessing the damage to breeding stock. Walter Montgomery extended his stay, his original week stretching into 2, as he observed frontier life with increasing fascination. Josephine found herself in the peculiar position of mediator between worlds, explaining Eastern societal structures. To Samuel's ranch hands over dinner, then helping Walter understand the practical necessities of territorial existence during their morning walks. Charlotte thrived under the arrangement, delighting in her uncle's stories of Boston while continuing her education with renewed enthusiasm. 10 days after the confrontation, Josephine sat at the crude desk in her quarters, staring at 2 documents. Side by side, Walter's formal outline of inheritance requirements and Samuel's property deed for Pinewood Ranch. Between them lay her grandfather's letter, delivered by Walter and unread until now. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. "My dear Josephine, if you are reading this, I have passed from this world, leaving you with both opportunity and obligation. Your father chose a path of principle over pragmatism, a decision that cost him my support, but never my respect. I recognized too late the courage required to pursue art and knowledge in a world increasingly devoted to commerce. My collection represents 50 years of appreciation for beauty and human achievement. I entrust it to you not as mere property, but as cultural legacy requiring stewardship. Where and how you choose to share this legacy is yours to determine. Boston offers established society, but suffers from calcified thinking. The West represents new possibilities, but lacks refinement. Perhaps the most valuable cultural institution is one that bridges such divides. Your grandmother often quoted Emerson, "Beauty is its own excuse for being." Yet beauty without purpose or accessibility becomes mere indulgence. Choose wisely, but choose according to your vision, not others' expectations. With faith in your judgment, Harrison Montgomery, Josephine set the letter down, her grandfather's words resonating unexpectedly with her present circumstances. The choice before her wasn't simply Boston or Colorado, career or family, past or future. It was about purpose. How best to honor both her cultural heritage and her evolving understanding of what truly mattered. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Samuel stood there, expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Charlotte and I are riding to Willow Creek for a picnic. She asked if you would join us." A smile touched his eyes. Actually, she insisted. The invitation offered welcome respite from her deliberations. "I'd like that." The creek lay in a sheltered valley untouched by the recent troubles. Cottonwoods whispered overhead, while Charlotte waded barefoot in the shallows, singing softly to herself, one of the melodies she had composed, now refined through Josephine's musical instruction. Samuel spread a blanket on the grassy bank, unpacking. The lunch Mrs. Turner had prepared. The domesticity of the scene struck Josephine anew, how naturally they had formed a family unit despite the unconventional beginning. "Your uncle leaves tomorrow," Samuel remarked, handing her a sandwich. "He seems to have developed unexpected appreciation for our uncivilized territory." "Walter has surprised me," Josephine admitted. "He's less rigid than I remembered. Perhaps I've changed too, seeing value where I once might have noticed only limitations." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "He mentioned you'll need to return east soon, regardless of your final decision about the inheritance." "Yes, there are legal requirements, documentation to sign." Josephine watched Charlotte balancing on stones across the creek, her copper braids catching sunlight. "But return doesn't necessarily mean remain." Hope flickered across Samuel's features before he carefully schooled his expression. "I wouldn't presume—" "Samuel." Josephine turned to face him directly. "Before Walter arrived, you asked me to consider becoming part of your family permanently. You never received my answer. Circumstances changed," he said quietly. "You now have options far beyond what Pinewood can offer. Do I?" She gestured toward Charlotte, who had discovered wildflowers along the bank and was gathering them with careful attention. What could be more valuable than watching her grow, than continuing our conversations about art and literature, than building something meaningful together? Samuel's gaze held hers steadily. "I won't compete with your grandfather's legacy. That collection belongs in a proper cultural institution where it can benefit many." "I agree completely," Josephine replied with sudden certainty, "which is why I've made my decision." That evening, Josephine gathered Walter, Samuel, and Charlotte in the ranch house sitting room. Mrs. Turner hovered nearby, pretending to dust while obviously listening. "I've decided how to proceed with grandfather's inheritance," Josephine announced. "Walter, I'll return to Boston with you to handle the legal requirements and arrange transportation of the collection. But I won't be staying." Walter nodded, unsurprised. "And the art? Your grandfather specified a cultural institution. I intend to honor that requirement." Josephine unfolded a roughly sketched plan on the table. The Montgomery Garrett Cultural Institute of Colorado Territory, to be constructed here in Silverdale. Samuel stared at the drawing. Josephine, such an institution would be unprecedented in this region. Exactly. Her voice strengthened with conviction. The railroad is coming. Silverdale will grow. What better time to establish a foundation for cultural appreciation, a place where Charlotte and children like her can learn music and art without traveling thousands of miles east, where ranchers with hidden artistic talents might find inspiration and community. Walter stroked his chin thoughtfully. Ambitious. The executors may question establishing such an institution in frontier territory. The will specifies only that the collection remain intact and be displayed appropriately for educational purposes. It doesn't dictate location. Josephine smiled. Grandfather wrote that beauty without accessibility becomes mere indulgence. What better way to honor his intent than bringing this collection to people who would otherwise never experience it? Charlotte, who had been listening with widening eyes, bounced in her seat. Would there be a real piano and art classes? Yes, Josephine assured her. Music rooms, exhibition space, a library of art books, perhaps eventually an academy offering formal instruction. The building costs alone would be considerable, Walter cautioned. The inheritance includes $30,000 in liquid assets, supplemented with community investment. Josephine glanced at Samuel, seeking confirmation. The territorial governor has been promoting cultural development, Samuel said slowly, ideas clearly forming. There are matching grants available for educational institutions, and with Harrington's schemes exposed, several investors are seeking more legitimate opportunities. Walter looked between them, recognition dawning. You've discussed this already. No, Samuel replied honestly. This is the first time I'm hearing Josephine's specific plan, but it aligns with possibilities I've considered since seeing the railroad surveys. The land adjacent to your northern boundary, Walter recalled from their property discussions. You mentioned it would likely become the new town center when the rail spur is completed. Samuel nodded. 10 acres would be sufficient for an institute of significant size, with room for expansion. I've held that parcel separately, anticipating community development needs. The discussion continued into the evening, the initial concept evolving as Walter contributed legal insights, Samuel offered practical construction knowledge, and Charlotte enthusiastically suggested features like outdoor performance spaces and student galleries. Mrs. Turner eventually abandoned all pretense of dusting to join the conversation, proposing a community kitchen for cultural celebrations. Later, when Charlotte had been sent to bed, still bubbling with excitement, and Walter had retired to pack for his journey, Josephine and Samuel stood on the porch beneath a canopy of stars. "You certain about this?" Samuel asked quietly. "Bringing your grandfather's collection to a territory many Easterners still consider wilderness?" "More certain than I've been about anything." Josephine gazed toward the mountains, their peaks silvered by moonlight. "My grandfather wrote that the most valuable cultural institution is one that bridges divides, between East and West, between practical necessity and artistic expression. Like a Boston piano teacher and a rancher who sketches Renaissance-inspired landscapes," Samuel suggested, a smile warming his voice. "Exactly." Josephine turned to face him. "I haven't forgotten your question from before Walter arrived. I believe my answer is evident, but for clarity, yes, Samuel, I would be honored to become Charlotte's mother and your wife." Samuel took her hands gently. "Even knowing the challenges ahead? Building an institute while integrating into frontier life won't be simple. The most meaningful things rarely are." Josephine's voice softened. "Douglas rejected me for being too cultured. You valued what he dismissed. How could I not recognize that as the rarest gift?" Samuel drew her closer. "We'll face scrutiny. Traditional Minds from both East and West, who see contradiction where we see complement. Then we'll change their thinking, one exhibit, one performance, one class at a time. Determination strengthened her tone. My parents created a home where knowledge and beauty were everyday companions, not distant ideals. My grandfather collected art not for prestige, but for the enrichment it brought. You built a ranch that honors both practical needs and aesthetic sensibilities. I want to continue that legacy, our shared legacy, here. Their kiss beneath the Colorado stars sealed more than a marriage agreement. It represented a vision for bridging worlds, often kept artificially separate. Culture and practicality, refinement and resilience, tradition and innovation. 6 months later, as spring transformed the landscape once again, the first cornerstone was laid for the Montgomery Garrett Cultural Institute on the hill overlooking Silverdale. The ceremony drew curious onlookers from surrounding ranches and settlements, many skeptical but intrigued by the unusual development. Josephine, now officially Mrs. Garrett, stood proudly beside Samuel and Charlotte as Walter Montgomery, who had returned for the occasion, delivered a speech about cultural frontiers that paralleled geographical ones. Rebecca Harrington, who had divorced her imprisoned husband and established herself as Silverdale's most sought-after music teacher, led the newly formed community choir in celebration. That evening, a wagon arrived at Pinewood Ranch carrying a specially constructed crate. Inside, protected by careful packing, was the first of Josephine's grandfather's collection to reach its new home, a magnificent piano that would temporarily reside in the Garrett living room until the institute was completed. As Charlotte's fingers touched the keys for the first time, her simple melody filled the room with sweet, clear notes. Samuel's arm encircled Josephine's waist, his expression one of quiet contentment mixed with pride. The music rose and fell, bridging the distance between Boston's refined parlors and Colorado's rugged landscape, proof that beauty could flourish. Wherever it was truly valued, he would have approved, Walter commented softly, watching his niece's family with evident satisfaction. Harrison always believed art belonged wherever it could inspire transformation. Josephine nodded, understanding, finally complete. She had been rejected for being too cultured, only to discover that true culture wasn't about location or social standing. It was about recognizing value where others saw only limitations, about building beauty within the fabric of everyday life rather than segregating it into rarefied spaces. As Charlotte's music danced through the ranch house, intertwining with the sounds of cattle lowing in distant pastures and wind rustling through pine trees, Josephine knew with absolute certainty she had found exactly where she belonged. 2 years later, the Montgomery Garrett Cultural Institute stood proudly on the hill overlooking a transformed Silverdale. The railroad had indeed brought growth, new businesses, families, and opportunities. The Institute's classical facade, designed by an architect from Denver who had studied in Paris, housed not only Harrison Montgomery's art collection, but also a growing library, music rooms, and exhibition spaces for local artists. On a warm summer evening, Josephine stood in the main gallery, making final preparations for the Institute's anniversary celebration. The walls displayed an eclectic combination. European masterpieces from her grandfather's collection hung alongside, Samuel's Western landscapes and works by regional artists previously unknown beyond their isolated communities. "The governor's party has just arrived," Samuel announced, entering the gallery. His formal attire suited him well, though he still moved with a rancher's easy confidence rather than urban stiffness. Josephine smiled, adjusting the display card beside a newly acquired sculpture. "And Charlotte?" Greeting guests with the poise of a born diplomat. "Mrs. Turner is supervising to ensure she doesn't overwhelm the territorial officials with questions about educational funding." Their laughter mingled comfortably, the sound of a partnership deepened by shared purpose and mutual respect. Samuel crossed to where Josephine stood, placing a gentle hand at the small of her back as he admired the exhibition. "Your grandfather would be proud," he observed, "not just of the collection's presentation, but of what you've built around it." "What we've built," she corrected, leaning slightly into his touch. "This couldn't exist without your vision for the land, your understanding of the community's needs." The Institute had indeed evolved beyond a simple gallery. Weekly classes taught everything from classical music to practical drafting. Local ranchers' wives learned embroidery techniques alongside reading Eastern literature. Miners' children discovered Shakespeare and scientific principles in the same afternoon. The boundaries between practical education and cultural enrichment had blurred exactly as Josephine had hoped. "We have visitors from 4 territories attending tonight," Samuel noted. "The Carson City newspaper is sending a correspondent to report on our unprecedented fusion of Eastern refinement and Western pragmatism." "Is that how they're describing us now?" Josephine laughed. "Better than misplaced cultural pretensions, as the Denver Post initially wrote." "Critics who become champions are the most effective advocates," Samuel replied, referencing the Denver editor who had recently dedicated an entire column to praising the Institute's approach to cultural education. A distinctive rhythmic tapping announced Walter Montgomery's approach. Though he had returned to his Boston law practice, he visited twice yearly, bringing new acquisitions and Eastern connections while returning with increasingly enthusiastic reports about territorial developments. "There you are," he called, maneuvering through the gallery with his signature cane, an affectation he'd adopted after his first Colorado winter left him with persistent knee trouble. "The governor is asking for you both. Something about modeling. The Institute's approach for the new territorial university." Josephine and Samuel exchanged pleased glances. Official recognition would bring additional funding possibilities and expanded reach for their educational programs. Walter paused before a painting, one of Samuel's recent works showing Charlotte at the piano, her expression captured in a moment of pure creative concentration. "Remarkable improvement in your technique, Samuel. The chiaroscuro effect rivals Rembrandt." "High praise from Montgomery," Samuel responded with a smile. "Though I suspect biased by family connection." "Bias nothing. I've spent 50 years studying fine art. I recognize quality regardless of its origin." Walter's tone carried the conviction of a converted skeptic. "Which reminds me, Rebecca's students are prepared for their performance. Quite impressive what she's accomplished with children who had never seen a piano before last year." The mention of Rebecca brought another dimension of satisfaction. After her divorce from Douglas, she had found her true calling as the Institute's music director, her genuine passion for teaching flourishing away from her former husband's suffocating expectations. As they moved toward the main hall, where guests were gathering, Josephine paused before a small display case near the entrance. Inside lay 2 items of particular significance: her parents' miniature portrait and Samuel's first sketchbook, open to his earliest drawing of Pinewood Ranch. Past and present, east and west, personal history and shared future. The sound of Charlotte's playing reached them from the performance space. No longer simple melodies, but complex compositions of her own creation, showing the technical mastery that had developed under Rebecca's tutelage, combined with the creative spirit. Josephine and Samuel had always encouraged. "She's applying to the Boston Conservatory next year," Josephine reminded Walter. "I'll hold you to your promise to watch over her." As if she needed watching, Walter scoffed good-naturedly. "That girl could navigate Boston society blindfolded. Though I suspect she'll return to Colorado after getting her credentials. She has plans for expanding the Institute's music program that she discusses with alarming specificity whenever we correspond." Samuel's expression softened with paternal pride. She talks of nothing else, creating Colorado's first symphony orchestra by the time she's 30. I wouldn't bet against her, Josephine said warmly. As they entered the main hall, conversations paused momentarily. The governor beckoned them forward while other guests, a mixture of Eastern investors, territorial officials, local ranchers, and their families, even a few Arapaho representatives from the nearby reservation, watched with interest. Standing before this diverse gathering, Josephine felt the weight of what they had created. Not just a building or an institution, but a new concept of what culture could mean in this evolving American landscape. Not a fragile import requiring protection from frontier realities, but a resilient force that gained strength from integration. With practical life, Douglas Harrington, serving his prison sentence in Denver, had ironically contributed to this success. His rejection had set Josephine on a path she might never have discovered otherwise, toward a man who recognized her true value, a community that eventually embraced her vision, and a purpose that harmonized her refined education with frontier resilience. As Samuel squeezed her hand gently before they stepped forward to address their guests, Josephine thought of the frightened, humiliated woman who had stood alone in Silverdale's dusty street 2 years earlier, rejected for being too cultured. How fortunate that rejection had been, how profoundly life could transform when one found the courage to create new definitions of belonging, of purpose, of home. Charlotte's music reached a triumphant crescendo in the adjacent room, the perfect accompaniment to Josephine's quiet certainty. She had not just found where she belonged, but had created something entirely new, a legacy that would continue to bridge worlds long after this evening's celebration ended. 5 years had passed since the founding of the Montgomery Garrett Cultural Institute. What had begun as an audacious experiment, bringing fine art to a frontier territory, had blossomed into something neither Josephine nor Samuel could have fully envisioned that first day on Silverdale's dusty main street. The autumn morning dawned crisp and golden as Josephine walked the Institute's grounds, reviewing preparations for today's momentous occasion. Stonemasons were completing the final touches on the new West Wing, the freshly carved inscription above its entrance reading, Charlotte Garrett School of Music and Composition. The expansion represented not just physical growth, but the fulfillment of promises made and visions shared. The delegation from Washington is approaching, called Samuel from the main entrance, his once dark hair now touched with distinguished silver at the temples. Time had only refined his bearing. Still a rancher at heart, but one whose integration of art and practicality had made him an unexpected but respected voice in territorial development. Josephine smoothed her elegant but practical day dress, a balance she had perfected over the years. Is Charlotte ready? As ready as anyone could be to perform an original composition for the Secretary of Education, Samuel replied with a mixture of pride and amusement. Though she insists it's merely another recital. At 20, Charlotte had grown into her extraordinary talents. After 2 years at the Boston Conservatory, where she had impressed even the most exacting professors, she had returned to Colorado not just with technical mastery, but with a revolutionary vision. Music education designed specifically for Western sensibilities and experiences. Her compositions blended classical structures with rhythms and themes that spoke directly to frontier life. The Institute itself had evolved beyond its original purpose as a simple gallery and educational center. It now stood as the cultural heart of a region undergoing rapid transformation. Railroad connections had integrated Silverdale into the national economy, bringing both opportunity and challenge. Through it all, the Institute had served as a ballast, preserving cultural foundations while embracing necessary change. Inside the main gallery, Josephine paused before a painting that still held special significance, Samuel's rendering of her profile on the porch that first summer, when possibilities between them were just beginning to unfold. His artistic skills had developed remarkably over the years, his work now featured in exhibitions as far east as Chicago. Yet he had never abandoned the ranch, insisting that his art drew essential vitality from his connection to the land and its practical demands. Reminiscing, came a familiar voice. Josephine turned to find Rebecca Ellis, remarried 3 years earlier to the territorial judge who had presided over her divorce, arranging final details for the student concert. The two women had formed an unlikely but powerful friendship, their shared appreciation for arts education transcending their complicated introduction. How quickly it all changes, Josephine reflected. 7 years ago, I was a rejected mail order, bride with nowhere to go. Now this, she gestured to encompass not just the institute, but all it represented. Rebecca adjusted a flower arrangement with practiced precision. I still remember Douglas's face when he first realized what you and Samuel were building. Even prison couldn't entirely mask his disbelief that the woman he rejected for being too cultured had created exactly what the territory needed. The mention of Douglas Harrington no longer carried emotional weight. Released after serving 4 years for fraud and conspiracy, he had departed for California, reportedly attempting to rebuild his fortune in mining ventures. His absence had allowed Silverdale to heal and progress beyond the divisions he had exploited. The Institute's main hall gradually filled with distinguished visitors, territorial officials, Eastern benefactors, representatives from other cultural institutions seeking to replicate their model. At the center of the gathering stood Walter Montgomery, now retired from legal practice and serving as the Institute's Eastern ambassador. His evolution from skeptical Bostonian to passionate advocate for frontier cultural development remained one of Josephine's greatest satisfactions. The secretary is particularly interested in your integration of native artistic traditions, Walter informed them, leaning on his now trademark silver-tipped cane. The Arapaho exhibition has generated significant correspondence from Washington. This initiative, providing space and resources for indigenous artists to preserve and share their cultural heritage, had begun as a tentative outreach program 3 years earlier. Under the guidance of Swift Feather, an Arapaho elder with unexpected connections to European artistic traditions through his French-Canadian education, it had developed into one of the Institute's most distinctive and celebrated features. We've only begun to explore those possibilities, Josephine acknowledged. The collaborative weaving program has a 2-year waiting list. Samuel checked his pocket watch. It's time. Charlotte will be looking for us. The performance hall, with its remarkable acoustics designed by an architect who had studied the great European concert venues, hushed as Charlotte Garrett took her place at the grand piano. No longer the eager 12-year-old practicing on a wooden drawing of keys, she commanded the instrument with confident authority. As Charlotte's fingers touched the keys, her original composition filled the space, a piece titled Convergence, that moved between classical structures and innovative expressions of Western experience. The music painted landscapes in sound, mountain dawns, cattle drives, frontier towns coming to life, but filtered through formal techniques that gave these experiences universal resonance. Josephine felt Samuel's hand find hers as they listened to their daughter's creation. The piece represented everything they had built together. Not just family and institution, but a philosophy that rejected artificial boundaries between refinement and practical life, between Eastern tradition and Western innovation. Following the performance and the enthusiastic reception from the secretary and assembled dignitaries, Josephine found a moment of quiet in her office overlooking the Institute's grounds. The view had changed dramatically over the years. The original building now anchored a campus that included dormitories for students from remote areas, specialized studios for various arts, and gardens designed to showcase native plantings alongside traditional European landscaping. A soft knock preceded Samuel's entrance. "The governor is requesting a personal tour before dinner. I'll be right there." Josephine rose, but Samuel motioned for her to remain seated. "First, I have something for you." From his coat, he withdrew a small, leather-bound book. "I've been working on this in private. Today seemed appropriate for sharing it." Josephine opened the book to find exquisite sketches documenting their journey. From her arrival in Silverdale, through the building of the Institute and beyond. Samuel had captured pivotal moments with remarkable sensitivity. Charlotte's first real piano lesson, Walter's grudging admiration of the ranch's beauty, the cornerstone ceremony for the Institute, and dozens of quiet domestic scenes that would never make historical records, but had formed the foundation of their shared life. "Samuel, this is extraordinary," she breathed, turning pages filled with their history. "The final pages are blank," he explained, sitting beside her. "Still to be written." "We've come far from that first meeting," Josephine reflected. "When you found me abandoned on a bench after Douglas's rejection." Samuel smiled, the years of partnership evident in his eyes. "I found precisely what I needed without knowing I was searching. A woman whose refinement would challenge me, whose courage would inspire me, whose vision would transform not just our lives but an entire community." Through the open window came the sounds of Charlotte explaining her compositional techniques to the secretary, her confident voice carrying the perfect balance of technical knowledge and passionate advocacy that her parents had modeled throughout her life. "Do you ever wonder," Josephine asked, "what might have happened if Douglas hadn't rejected me for being too cultured? If he had married me as planned?" Samuel considered the question thoughtfully. The world would have lost something significant. Not just this institute or Charlotte's music or my artwork, but the demonstration that culture isn't something fragile that needs protection from frontier realities. It's something that gains richness when integrated with practical life rather than isolated from it. From outside came the sounds of arriving dinner guests, ranchers and their families mingling comfortably with government officials and Eastern patrons, children from the Institute's scholarship program proudly showing their artwork to visitors. "I should greet the governor," Josephine said, closing the precious sketchbook carefully. Samuel nodded, but held her hand a moment longer. "When I saw you that first day, I recognized something beyond your obvious education and refinement. I saw resilience, the capacity to not just survive disappointment, but to transform it into something meaningful. And I saw a man who understood that practical skills and cultural appreciation aren't opposing forces, but complementary strengths," Josephine replied. "Who recognized that being too cultured wasn't a liability, but a foundation we could build upon." As they walked together toward their waiting guests, Josephine thought of the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 7 years earlier, heart full of hope and uncertainty. How grateful she was for Douglas Harrington's rejection, the painful moment that had ultimately directed her toward her true purpose. The setting sun painted the Institute's western facade in gold as voices and music spilled from its windows into the cooling evening air. Children from town practiced dance steps on the lawn, while students explained their artwork to curious visitors. Charlotte's voice carried from the performance hall, now instructing younger musicians with the patience and insight her parents had once shown her. "Your grandfather was right," Samuel observed quietly as they paused in the doorway. "The most valuable cultural institution is one that bridges divides. And the most valuable life," Josephine added, "is one that does the same." Together, they stepped forward to welcome their guests, the self-taught rancher, and the woman once deemed too cultured for frontier life, whose unique partnership had created something neither could have achieved alone, a living demonstration that true refinement wasn't about location or circumstance, but about recognizing value and beauty wherever they might be found, and having the courage to nurture them into full, magnificent bloom. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.